in my life. I've been very blessed to have been in the right spot at the right time. And now it's Mexico City. But education, a strong work ethic, a supportive family, and a sense of adventure were also important factors in my life. I am proud to have served my country, both in the United States Air Force and in the Apollo program. I like being a team player. When people work together, you can sometimes accomplish the impossible. But before I get ahead of myself, let me tell you a little bit about my grand adventure, which never could have happened without the cooperation and efforts of many people working together toward a shared goal. And then I'll give you a glimpse of what I think we should be doing in the future. Mankind has dreamed for centuries of reaching space, the moon, and even the stars. But it wasn't until the 20th century that man took his first powered flight. In 1903, on a windy morning at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the Wright brothers, Flyer, took their first flight defying gravity. My mother, Marion Moon, was born that same year. Only 66 years later, Neil and I stepped on the moon, fulfilling the dreams of millions. And this is my story of how we got there, and how when a team works well together, the world can achieve the next impossible dream. I took my first flight at age 2 with my father, Edwin Eugene Aldrin. He was an engineer and an aviation pioneer, a friend of Charles Lindbergh, Orville Wright, Howard Hughes, many people. That time, we flew in a Lockheed Vega single-engine plane, painted red to look like an eagle, the symbol of our country in America. The name of the spacecraft, Eagle, that we chose to land on the moon. Surrounded by the influence of aviation, I entered the United States Air Force after graduating from the Military Academy at West Point. And here I am during a photo opportunity. He wasn't flying with me. That's my father. He was also in the Air Force, many years in the reserve at the end of World War I, and he was involved in World War II. And this was the occasion where I received my Air Force pilot wings. My father was a civilian aviation manager of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, where he directed the aviation division. He later became the manager of Newark Airport, New Jersey, where I was born. He also worked as a consultant to the Manned Spacecraft Center for the Safety Director at NASA. After training, I was in the Korean War as a jet fighter pilot, where I flew 66 combat missions in the F-86 Sabre jet, shot down 2 enemy MiG-15 aircraft. Following the Korean War, I was stationed in Germany. I've been briefly at the Air Force Academy and other places, but I was stationed in Germany when Sputnik went over. We were flying supersonic F-100s in the late 50s, the Cold War between Soviet Union and the United States was escalating and the tensions were high. In October of 1957, we went on alert with nuclear weapons on the aircraft. But while I was stationed in Germany, the Soviet Union pulled off a sudden and unexpected technological feat. They launched Sputnik into orbit, and in response, a year later, America formed NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, with the goal of reaching space. The space age was born, and the space race was about to begin. On April 12th, 1961, the Soviets made an incredible achievement by sending the first human into space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, for one full orbit around the Earth. In response, only a few weeks later, NASA launched its first Mercury astronaut, Alan Shepard, on only a 15-minute suborbital flight that barely touched the edge of space. It was impressive, but we all wondered, what's coming next? President John F. Kennedy asked NASA and the engineers and rocket scientists led by Werner von Braun what was possible. And they told him that it would take at least 15 years before we could put a man on the moon. Instead of accepting what was possible, on May 25th, just 3 weeks after Alan Shepard's suborbital flight, President Kennedy boldly challenged America to commit to the goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. We'd not even put a man into orbit. The rockets and spacecraft needed to go beyond Earth orbit didn't exist. Many thought the challenge was impossible. We just didn't have the know-how. But we did have a leader with the vision and the determination, the courage, the confidence that we could get there. By publicly stating our goal and putting a specific time period on a very specific accomplishment, President Kennedy gave us no back door. We either had to do it or fail. And none of us were interested in failing. If space was going to be our next frontier, then I wanted to be a part of getting there. So after I completed my tour of duty in Germany, I decided to continue my education at the same place that my father got his doctor's degree. I applied for a doctor's degree in astronautics at MIT. For my thesis, I adapted my experience as a fighter pilot intercepting enemy aircraft to devise a technique by step, eliminating the variables and then making an intercept. I devised a technique for two spacecraft to meet in space called manned orbital rendezvous. Little did anyone know, including me, how critical this work would later become to our successfully landing on the moon and coming back home. The first time I applied to be a NASA astronaut, I was turned down because I had not received test pilot training. I always wanted to look beyond the future instead of testing what we have now. But I was determined, and I applied again the next year, and this time my jet fighter experience and NASA's interest in my concept for a space rendezvous, I guess, influenced them to accept me in the third group of astronauts, where I became known by my astronaut peers as Dr. Rendezvous. 7 people in the first group, 9 in the second group, 14. Total of 30 astronauts. Now, in addition to Werner von Braun trying to tell us how to get to the moon, there was an engineer, John Houbolt, a clever NASA engineer, and figured out that if we used 2 specialized spacecraft, leaving the Earth, coming back, and then doing activities at the moon, a command and service module that would come back to the Earth would remain in orbit around the moon. Then a descent stage and ascent stage lunar module would land and later lift off and rendezvous with the command and service module. And that way the propulsion and the big rocket and the landing didn't have to be so big. And we could leave the lander on the surface. And once we rendezvoused, we could leave the ascent stage at the moon. So this is where my MIT rendezvous studies really paid off. The critical key to this approach would be our ability to reliably rendezvous 2 spacecraft in orbit around the moon. It'd be much safer to do Earth orbit rendezvous instead of lunar orbit rendezvous. That's the way the argument was phrased. The only trouble is, it was 2 Saturn V's versus 1 Saturn V to do the lunar orbit. Now, if that failed, there'd be no way to rescue the astronauts. But my MIT work was just what was needed and was exercised many times in the Gemini program with a couple of little failures on my last flight in Gemini. So Mercury was the first stage of the space program, followed by the Gemini, the twins, Castor and Pollux, which was used to fill the gap between the very simple, non-maneuvering Mercury capsule and the very complex spacecraft that were needed for Apollo. So Gemini was an integral part of our training, as it helped us to learn to spacewalk. That was one of the objectives. And as an avid scuba diver, I was welcoming that experience. And I became the first astronaut to train underwater, simulating weightlessness of space, called neutral buoyancy. And during my first space flight as pilot of Gemini 12, on 3 different exits, I was able to set a 5.5-hour world record spacewalking while circling the globe every 90 minutes, 17,000 miles an hour. What a sight to behold the Earth below while floating outside the capsule. After 5 days in orbit, Jim Lovell and I returned to Earth, having completed the final mission of the Gemini program. It was November 1966, and we had only 3 years left to accomplish Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Gemini had prepared us for the Apollo missions to the moon, but we still had a lot of work to do. In all, there was a team of 400,000 people working together on a common dream. The engineers, technicians, designing and building the multi-stage Saturn V rocket, the rocket scientists, aerospace industry contractors, NASA administrators, even the seamstress who sewed our space suits together.